I met with a state senator this morning, and he asked me, how did someone like you, and he did not mean this in a degrading fashion, but he was like, how did someone like you become interested in finance and economics? That's actually a very good question. And it's not something I'm going to get into right now. However, basically what it all came down to is I started studying, as Ruth mentioned, something called Austrian economics, which we'll get into here shortly. And what it revealed to me was that everything that I've been taught about economics in school and everything that I read in economics in mainstream publications was wrong, unfortunately. So I am not an economist. Take everything I say, therefore, with a grain of salt, in that you guys shouldn't believe me. However, you also shouldn't believe the people that are just writing stuff out there. Okay, just because you have a PhD in economics, unfortunately, I think we've learned over the past several years that doesn't mean a whole lot. So I think as Benjamin Franklin said, question authority, and I think one of the problems that we have in our country today is that we don't question authority. If an expert comes out and says something, we all just say they're right. So hopefully I can give you a different perspective on economics and the question, most important question in the world, money. But I'm not going to talk about how to make more of it. I'm not going to talk about what to do with it. I'm going to talk about what function money serves in society, how it came about, the brief history of money, and especially of central banking, and then how our money got so messed up, ended up in the situation that we're in, and where we might be going in the future. An economist is, love this definition, a trained professional paid to guess wrong about the economy. If you pick up like Time magazine, or you pick up a lot of Barron's or whatever, Bloomberg, these guys, they'll get 10 economists together and they'll all have predictions for the year. They always disagree. Now, if this is a science, if economics is a hard science, we should be able to agree because the proof is right there, okay? But these guys all agree, and inevitably, 9 of them are wrong. Now, how can that be? Because I guarantee you, they are not stupid. They're a lot smarter than I am if they have PhDs in economics. The reason is that they're studying this. They're studying numbers. They're studying algebraic formulas. They're developing computer models. And what they're saying is these things can predict what human beings do. Now, where's the big flaw in that argument? Well, human beings, but we're all blessed with free will. You can't predict what anyone's going to do. Now, you may be able to statistically, say in 99% of the situations, this is what's going to happen, but what happens in that 100% of the situation? And the thing is, we live in such a complex world and such a complex economy that 1% is what's going to get you. So, as I said, I subscribe to a school called the Austrian School of Economics. The difference is Austrians don't study numbers, and they don't try to make predictions about the economy because that's impossible. Because again, we're dealing with people. People have free will. Austrians study, it's actually the study of purposeful human action, or as I like to call it, how do people satisfy their wants, which are infinite. Okay, all of us want more stuff and we always need more stuff. And if our belly's full, we want something else. And if we have one sports car, we want a house, right? And it just keeps on going on and on and on and on. That's just the way human beings are. Our wants are infinite, but we live in a world of scarce resources, what economists call goods, okay? In other words, there is nothing in our world virtually that's infinite, You may have what they would economists refer to as free goods, which would be air, okay? But everything else, everything in here, it's all finite. Even our time, which is a component of every action that we take, even our time is scarce. mean, think about it. You only have so much time on the planet. You can only be in one place at one time. You can really, especially my wife says this about me a lot, you can really only be doing one thing at one time. So let's compare apples and oranges. And this is this is actually the underlying law of the entire body of economics, okay? If you have one apple, you are going to apply it to your most urgent need, okay? If you're hungry, you're going to eat it. That one apple is incredibly valuable to you if it's the only one that you can get. Think about that. It's the only apple in the whole world, the only one you can get. That apple is going to be really important to you. Well, if you get another apple, you're going to apply the first one. It doesn't matter which apple it is. You just have two apples now. You're going to apply the first one to your most urgent need. You will apply the second apple to your second most urgent need. You may dry it to eat it later, okay? If you have three apples, same thing. You'll eat the first one. You may dry the second one. You may make applesauce out of the third one. Or you can do something else with it. Maybe you'll harvest the seeds out of that one so you can plant that apple and produce more apples later. So you can build capital. Well, if you have a bunch of apples, each of these apples, and I'm talking bunches, I can't put up on my screen. There's a place over by me called Carver's. It's Carver's Apple Farm, and they've got a big apple restaurant, and everything is about apples. They have apples coming out of their ears, right? Well, what do? Well, let's say that someone here has a bunch of oranges. Now, again, it's the same situation. Each of these oranges, or if you just have one orange, that's really important to you. But as you gain more and more oranges, each of those oranges is less important to you. Eventually, I'm going to be like, you know what? I hate apples because all I do is eat apples. Okay? I want an orange. So I'm going to ask you for an orange because your orange now has more value to me than that apple because I have so many apples. Likewise, you have so many oranges. This is the underlying law of economics. It's called subjective marginal utility, or sometimes diminishing marginal utility. It says that things do not have intrinsic value. They only have the value that we assign to them. It's subjective. We use each additional unit of a good for a less important or a more marginal purpose. Thus, the more of something we have, the less value we place on each individual unit of that something. Whoops. But here's the kicker. And this is the difference between Austrian, or one of the differences, but this is one of the big differences between Austrian economics and mainstream or Keynesian economics. The law of diminishing marginal utility applies to money, just like it does everything else. The man who discovered this law is a guy named Carl Menger, and this was back in like the 1860s. And what he discovered, subjective marginal utility, was so important that the movement that he launched was called the marginalist revolution. And if you're wondering why it's called the Austrian School of Economics, it's quite simple. He was from Austria. Now, money makes civilization possible. Money's gotten a really bad rap over the years, but it makes civilization possible. Think about what your life would be without money. Let's imagine that I have a pickle, but not only is it a pickle, it is a magical dancing pickle. But again, I have a lot of these pickles, okay? So I want to trade one of my pickles for an egg. So I go to the egg farm and I'm like, I got this really cool pickle. Would you trade me an egg for my pickle? And he says, no, your pickles make me puke. What I really need is I need some grain for my chickens. So I go to the wheat farmer and I say, I got a magical pickle. Would you give me some grain so I can go back to the egg guy, the chicken guy, so I can get an egg? And he says, no, your pickles are putrid. What I need some nails for my fences to keep the deer out so they quit eating my wheat. So I go to the blacksmith. And I'm like, Look, I would really like some nails for this pickle, okay? So I can take the nails back to the grain farmer who will then, take the grain back to the chicken farmer who will give me an egg. And the blacksmith says, no, your pickles make me feel prickly. What I need is some coal to run my stove or to run my billows. You see, it goes on and on and on and on. Economists call this the double coincidence of ones. The only way that I can get an egg if I have a pickle is to find an egg entrepreneur with a passion for pickles. Now, wouldn't it be so much easier if I could just say, hey, dude, I've got $1, can I get an egg? That's what money does. Barter is an incredibly inefficient economic system. Money, on the other hand, eliminates this and allows us to trade with each other much more easily. I'm sure many of you recognize this lady in this book. Ayn Rand wrote an awesome book, Atlas Shrugged. Money, the root of all evil. First of all, that's a misquotation of a biblical phrase which says, the love of money is the root of all evil. They're talking about greed. They're not talking about money itself. Rand said, and this is absolutely true, unless and until you discover that money is the root of all good, you ask for your own destruction. When money ceases to become the means by which men deal with one another, then men become the tools of other men. Blood, whips, and guns, or dollars. Take your choice. There is no other. This is a theme that you will see running through the work of this man. This is F.A. Hayek. He won a Nobel Prize in economics. He's also an Austrian economist, and he also wrote a very good book called The Road to Serfdom. Throughout his economic work, you'll find this theme running through it, that the market is a discovery process. The market is an information system that provides entrepreneurs with the data necessary to make decisions about what goods to produce and, in turn, where and how to allocate resources. Excuse me. The way it does this is if there's a shortage of a good, or if consumer demand rises for a good, what happens to that good? The price goes up. Now, if you're a smart entrepreneur, what do? You move into that sector of the economy. You devote more resources into producing that good. Well, what happens? Resources are scarce. So what may happen temporarily? There's going to be less resources devoted to making other goods. You're going to have a shortage of other goods, which means that the price of those goods is in turn going to rise, so people move back. In that way, the market is self-regulating. But it's always moving towards, but it's never quite achieving equilibrium prices. Equilibrium prices is where the market clears, where there are no more willing buyers and no more willing sellers at a certain price. The reason you can't achieve equilibrium prices and have them stay there is because of consumer preferences as well as supply and demand, we're looking at a moving target, okay? But through the pricing mechanism that is inherent in the free market, entrepreneurs do have a way of being able to gauge. And then the market keeps them in line by, like I said, by regulating, through the price mechanism. Market prices give us an objective way to measure the value of goods against one another. Now, I said we're dealing with subjective marginal utility, which means the value that we place on things is subjective. When we're talking about prices, that is something that we can see out here, okay? It's not just in our minds. It's actually a reflection of all of our valuations of a good. So they are objective. They are a real thing, a real tangible thing. Money is a unique commodity in that it has a universal price because everything is measured in terms of money. Almost every transaction in our economy, 1/2 of it is money. What you're really doing, if you think about it, are you buying and selling the product, or are you buying and selling the money? Okay? Now, you can think about it either way. Money, with virtually everything, makes up 1/2 of a transaction. Over here you have the product or service. Over here you have the money, which you trade for it. Thus, money is defined as a society's medium of exchange, which is what the formal definition is. Money has certain characteristics. It's durable, it's divisible, it's homogeneous, portable, scarce and relatively consistent supply, high unit value, and universally accepted, okay? If a society uses something as money and it's not durable, in other words, if you use fish and they spoil, who wants that as their money? If it's not divisible, okay? For instance, throughout history, people have used livestock as money sometimes. Well, you can't chop up a cow, and if you don't have a way to refrigerate it, the cow loses value, right? It has to be homogeneous. It has to be the same throughout. And I should back up here for a second. Also, if you think about, like, diamonds should make really good money, right? Because they pretty much satisfy all those characteristics. Well, the problem with diamonds is what happens if I got the Hope diamond, I'm going to divide it up. All of a sudden, it's much less valuable than it was as a single unit. Likewise, homogeneous. Real estate does not make good money because it's not the same throughout. Coastal and waterfront property is probably going to cost a lot more than where I live, up in the mountains and land that you can't really use. It has to be portable. You have to be able to take it with you. It has to have scarce and relatively consistent supply. If you can if you have seashells and that's your money, well, I mean, what's the point of me producing something and trading it for seashells? Because you can just run down to the beach and just grab a whole bunch more seashells, right? Has to have high unit value. That sort of goes along with being portable. And it also has to be universally accepted. Okay? If people don't want it, it's not going to make good money. Plutonium satisfies all of these, except if someone gives it to you and you don't know how to handle it properly, you die. That's not really good money. So everybody wants to have it. Throughout history, many different things have been used as money, as I mentioned. Fish hooks, wampum, as the Native Americans called it, beads, cattle, and even cigarettes, like in prisoner of war camps. People use cigarettes as money. But over 6,000 years, one thing has emerged as money. Precious metals, specifically gold and silver. Now, people like me who believe that gold and silver are real money and the little green things that we put in our wallet ain't so much, are often referred to as gold bugs and are ridiculed. Gold is a barbarous relic. With John Maynard Keynes, who we'll get to in a minute, was the most important economist of the 20th century, and he once said that. Well, it's not that at all. I don't have a fetish for gold. What it is the fact that gold and silver satisfy those characteristics that I showed you on the last slide. That's all it is. Now, it's important to mention that the king did not invent money. He wrote some really great songs, but he didn't invent money. But of course, not that king, this king. We know that money arose on the market because it does have a universal price, okay? The king wouldn't have gone around and sent out his men to price everything. It was priced. Gold and silver, people were trading those and the prices emerged on the market. And that's what happened. Nevertheless, I don't know if you guys have noticed this, but governments like to control everything, right? Yeah. Well, because money emerged on the market, because the king didn't have absolute control, he had some problems. First of all, he couldn't just tax his citizens to death, because if you do that, they revolt. Okay? So what did he do? Well, he would do things like he would demand that only his coins be accepted, that they were the legal tender. And then every once in a while, he would call all the coins in, or when they came into the royal treasury, he would send them over to be reissued. But they would engage in a practice which is called clipping, in where they would take off the outer edges of the gold or silver. And of course, they would reissue the coin then, but then they would keep the gold and silver for themselves. And by the way, that's why our coins, like a quarter, have milling around the edges. So you can't do that. It's not that our coins are gold or silver, it's just left over from that particular period. Another thing that they would do is, and by the way, people would sort of catch on, 20 years ago, your coins were this big, and by, now they're that big. Eventually, they start at the size of a quarter, and they come back at some point the size of a dime. People started catching on to that one. So they would also just debase the currency, where they'd bring the currency in, they would send it to the royal smelters, who would melt it down, keep a small portion of the gold or silver for the king, mix them with lead or copper or something like that, and reissue them, okay? So that was a couple ways in which he tried to control money, and he would try to tax people without people realizing they were being taxed, which sort of kind of happens today as well. But the king wasn't the only person interested in controlling money. These guys are goldsmiths. There's one problem with gold and silver as your money. Anyone that's run around with a pocket full of silver, it can be a little heavy. And it also clinks. Now, if you're walking down a dark alley in a bad part of town and you're clinking, who are the thieves going to go after? You, right? So people would take their money down to the goldsmith. And they would give it to the gold, because he had safes and he had security because he dealt in gold and silver. And they would give it to the goldsmith, and he would put it in his vaults. And then they would actually pay him money just like we would pay to have our stuff stored at a self-storage unit. And then he would give them a receipt for the gold and silver. Well, what would happen over time is that people would be out in the marketplace, and they'd be wanting to buy stuff. Well, they didn't want to run all the way down to the goldsmith to get their gold back out, right? So they would endorse the receipt and use that in the exchange. And the receipts that were issued on the gold and silver became a substitute for money. They became a money substitute. This is not paper money. Paper money is a different thing. This is a substitute. They were still backed by the gold or silver. These guys are really smart. And they went, people generally don't come in and actually withdraw their deposits from us. They're using the receipts as money. So what would happen would people would come into the goldsmith and ask for a loan, and instead of the goldsmith going and, loaning out some gold, they would just write out a receipt and give it to them, okay? There's one problem with that. There wasn't any gold to back up that receipt. What they were doing was inflating the money supply. It was a fraudulent activity. But that didn't stop them from charging interest on those receipts, on that money. They were creating money out of thin air. This is what our current banking system is based on, something called fractional reserve banking. If all of us were to go down to our bank where we had a deposit and demand our money back all at the same time, they wouldn't even come close to being able to give all of us our money. They rely on our confidence that our money's there, and we're not all going to go down and pull the money out of the bank at the same time. What this does on a societal level is it increases the money supply, which is what leads to price inflation. In 1694, England was bankrupt from a series of wars, long wars, civil war, short on money, weak credit, and couldn't raise taxes. Taxes were already too high. If they raised taxes, they're going to have a revolution. So the government was in a lot of trouble. So they turned to a gentleman named William Patterson. He had a financial group. And what Patterson said was, okay, we will lend you money, but in exchange for that, we want the royal tax deposits, the money, the royal tax revenue, deposited at our bank. Through the process of fractional reserve banking, then, he could make a lot of money because he had all this money coming into his bank. Fractional reserve banking is like a reverse pyramid. Down here you have a base, okay? Off of that, you pyramid your money on top. This is the only money that existed before you created the money out of thin air. This is all the money upon which you are drawing interest. The one thing that Parliament did not do was say that the Bank of England notes would have legal tender status, which meant, of course, that they were backed by force of law, that people had to use them. They thought that was going a little too far. Our government doesn't think so. Anyway, England benefited because a legitimate bank was now financing it, and they have much better credit rating. Patterson benefited because the bank, as I said, could pyramid its notes on top of the government's deposits. The Bank of England was the world's first central bank, and it is the model for our Federal Reserve System. In the previous two slides, I showed you the government, the king, and private interests. When they collude, what did Benito Mussolini call that? Fascism, right? Nicer way of terming it is corporatism. Nevertheless, that is what it is. There are two free market checks on bank inflation. It's important to realize that banks want to inflate so that they can make a profit. The government wants to inflate so they don't have to tax the citizens directly, because again, if you raise taxes too high, people tend to revolt. The two checks are sound money, which is gold and silver. Now, even if you have a fractional reserve system in which your gold and silver only makes up, the banks can pyramid on top of, say, a 10% reserve, all right? Nevertheless, the bank is still restricted in its ability to loan, somewhat. If you have 100% backing of gold and silver, they can't inflate their notes at all. The money is there, and that's the only money. So sound money is very important. And the other thing is competition between banks. Often we hear bank runs derided as, again, as a barbarous relic or a thing of the past. And remember in It's a Wonderful Life, remember where everybody goes to get their money out of George Bailey's bank. And he's able to do it, but he has a very hard time. That's what we normally think of. It's a very, very bad thing, right? Well, bank runs are a bad thing for the people that can't get their money out. But what they do is they keep the banking industry and the bankers honest, okay? And let me give you an example of that. Let's say, for instance, that there is no regulation on the amount of money that I have to keep, the base that I would have to keep in reserve to fulfill my notes. So I have, and let's say that $1 is, we're talking about silver dollars here. Okay, so $1 is an ounce of silver. So for every ounce, I keep a 10% reserve. So for every 10 notes out there, I only keep 1 ounce of silver in my vault. In other words, only the first person that comes into the bank gets his silver dollar back. Everybody else is like, I'm really sorry, I don't have any money. So that's not good for me, okay? Now, let's say that Ruth she's a lot smarter than I am, and she's not nearly as risky a business person. She keeps a 50% reserve. So for every 10 notes that she issues, she can redeem 5 of them. So 5 people come in, she's okay. 6th person comes in, she's in some trouble. So she's hoping the bank run doesn't go on that long, and maybe once Glenn is wiped out, everybody's good with it. Okay. My friend Rich, he's the smartest guy in the room, and he keeps a 90% reserve, which means that for every 10 notes that he issues, 9 of them are covered by an ounce of silver. So he's going to be pretty good, hopefully. Now let's say that someone else is really, really bright and they keep 100% reserve. They can withstand the bank run. Okay? So what it does is it discourages risky competition between the banks, that is, discourages risky behavior in the banking system by inflating your money supply too much. Now, if I were a big, huge, enormous bank, and by the way, folks, you will never meet a more free market person than I am, but I don't necessarily have a love of big, big, big business that wants to use the government to give themselves an advantage and create a monopoly, okay? But if I was a big, huge business, what do I don't like? I don't like competition, right? I'm going to try to get rid of competition because I want to make a lot of money. Well, that's what our Federal Reserve System did. It put almost all the banks into the system, and it told them all that you can inflate or cannot inflate to this extent, okay? So it eliminated that competition between the banks. The second thing that it did, we've all heard the lender of last resort term, right? The media says, here, lender of last resort, man, we get in trouble, the Fed's going to come in, they're going to save the day. Except the Fed doesn't have any money. There's really no money on reserve at the Fed other than the reserves that the banks put there. So what are they doing? The lender of last resort means that they print a bunch of money and give it to you so that you, if you are an irresponsible banker or an irresponsible lender or an irresponsible government-backed agency like Freddie or Fannie, you engage in that irresponsible behavior and they come in and they save you by printing a lot of money with all the deleterious effects. Central planning does not work, and there are a few reasons for that. Central planners do not have perfect knowledge. The people in Washington, D.C. cannot look into a crystal ball and actually tell you what the economy is doing. They make up a lot of those numbers. I had a friend that worked for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is tasked with producing the unemployment reports. And he told me that he would actually do the surveys where he's calling employers, asking them if they're hiring or firing, all that stuff. And if he got a response that his bosses didn't like, they would just say, oh, that's an anomaly, discard it. Of course, that went on more than an anomaly would, right? But they don't have a magic crystal ball that they can look in and have perfect knowledge of economic conditions. This is also something that Hayek talked about. In a centrally planned economy, prices are absent. Since prices are absent, remember the important role that prices played in keeping self-regulated, or allowing the economy to self-regulate. Since prices are absent, central planners have no way of determining how to allocate resources. They're not looking at it like an entrepreneur does. When the price of something goes up, there's no price. They don't know. That's why in the Soviet Union, they had no idea. They had consumer prices because the government would say these are the consumer prices. They didn't have producer prices. So do you take this steel and do you send it over to be made into washing machines, or do you send it over to be made into cars or forks or whatever else? They didn't know. They had no idea. They had no idea what the consumer wanted because there were no prices to reflect that. As a result, the economy will eventually collapse. This is another Austrian economist. His name is Ludwig von Mises. In 1920, he wrote this book, actually a short essay, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. He predicted the fall of the Soviet Union because there were no prices. Now, I'm sure that the arms race had something else and helped that along, but nevertheless, Mises realized way back then, because they don't have prices, they're not going to be able to allocate resources correctly. Their economy is going to fail at some point. Central planning of the money supply is the worst kind of central planning. The reason for that is because money is an economy's most important commodity. It is 1/2 of every exchange. So if the money is corrupted, the entire economy is then distorted. The entire economy is corrupted. The price system that allows free market to regulate itself. The price system, which entrepreneurs rely on to make sound economic decisions, it's no longer reliable. The result is the familiar boom-bust cycle. There is nothing inherent in the free market which would cause a periodic, darn near predictable boom-bust cycle as we have seen over the past, actually going back to the start of the Federal Reserve. Every few years, we get a boom, and then we have a bust, and then we have a boom, then we have a bust, except for this one, which we haven't had much of a boom on. Yeah, now we just had a bust on this one. Yeah, but it is, we can sort of see that pattern, and there's no reason for that to happen in the free market. And in fact, the Keynesian economists, they make up some excuses, but they can't really explain why it happens. The Austrians do. This is from Economic Depressions, Their Cause and Cure by Murray and Rothbard. If then the economy has a built-in natural selection mechanism for good entrepreneurs, this means that generally we would expect not many business firms to be making losses. And what he means by that is, what happens if you're a successful business guy? You get more market share, your business grows, right? Now what happens if you're not a good business guy? You go out of business. So generally, we're going to actually have natural selection, survival of the fittest, in that the better entrepreneurs are going to be the ones that survive and the ones that have greater market share. If in fact, we look around at the economy on an average day or year, we would find that losses are not very widespread. It's true. But in that case, the odd fact that needs explaining is this: how is it that periodically, in times of the onset of recessions, and especially in steep depressions, the business world suddenly experiences a massive cluster of severe losses? How is it that these formerly successful businessmen all of a sudden get hit with the dumb stick and can't make good business decisions anymore? A moment arrives when business firms, previously highly astute entrepreneurs in their ability to make profits and avoid losses, suddenly and dismayingly find themselves, almost all of them, suffering severe and unaccountable losses. How come? The reason is the money has been corrupted. Their barometer for determining where to allocate resources has been corrupted. Let me give you an example. Let's look at the housing bust, for example. If I'm a good entrepreneur, businessman, my goal is to make money. How is everybody making money in the housing bubble? You got into the housing market, or you got into one of the ancillary supporting markets, okay? So let's say that I make windows in my factory. Generally, I make car windows. But all of a sudden, there's this enormous demand for housing, for windows for houses. What am I going to do if I'm a good entrepreneur? I got to make some money. I'm getting killed. My competitors, their stock prices are going through the roof because they're making windows for houses. I got to start making windows for houses. So I retool my factory to start making windows for houses. Then eventually, the bubble is pricked and it all collapses. Okay, I can't make any windows for houses anymore because no one wants them. What am I going to do? I have to retool my factory again, a process which takes time. That's what we've seen in the bust, to go back to making windows for cars. I give you another example which does not involve entrepreneurs, but involves the labor market. Spain had a housing bubble which is about twice as bad as what we had here. College students who were studying medicine, engineering, chemistry, biology, accounting, what did they do to make money? These real estate agents are killing it out there. So I'm going to quit college and I'm going to go become a real estate agent. So I'm going to leave my training behind there. I'm going to go over here. I get into the real estate market and bam, what happens? Well, they have a real estate bust. Oh my gosh, I can't make any money as a real estate agent now. Now I got to hopefully get back in school, and I'll probably have student loans, but I have to go back to school to become an engineer, a chemist, a biologist, or any of these things. Again, something that takes time. And again, these aren't stupid people. What we're seeing is the signals which they rely on to make decisions about their livelihood were corrupted, same thing in Spain, by an artificial inflation of the money supply. Let's look at how money enters an economy. This is Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke. He has earned the nickname Helicopter Ben because he made a speech, I believe it was in 2007, where he said that America will never suffer another deflationary depression like the Great Depression because we have this tool called the printing press. And we will just print money like there's no tomorrow. And he's followed through on that promise. However, this is not how money actually enters the economy. Money is injected into the economy. When the Fed, as it's doing right now, buys, issues $85 billion a month in new notes, essentially. How much have any of you gotten? I know I've never gotten a check from the Federal Reserve. Okay, and actually, you're not going to because they don't deal with normal banks. They only deal with certain banks, the commercial banks, the big guys, the primary dealers. They're the ones who get the money first. Now, what happens if they get the money first? If you're a counterfeiter, what can you do with the money? You go out and get to spend it. You spend it before anybody else does. You can go out and buy stocks and buy real estate. Well, you have more money flowing into those markets, what happens? The price goes up. That filters down through the rest of the economy because other people then start getting the money. What happens to food? The price goes up. See, when the first people get the money, they get it before the prices have gone up. They get to buy everything at the previous price level. It's a bargain. By the time that the rest of us get the money, prices are starting to go up. By the time that the poor and people on fixed income get the money, because people on fixed income actually don't get the money at all, prices, inflation has already taken hold. This is a process which happens over time. Milton Friedman, who won a Nobel Prize in economics, estimated, and I don't know if his estimate is really good, because again, we're not talking about predictive things here, but he thought that it would take new money 18 months to 2 years before we would actually feel the price inflation. There's some reasons why, despite all the money that the Fed has printed and has printed, we haven't seen it, but we can get into that in the question and answer session. So, the result is that monetary inflation hurts the poor, and that, not the free market, is what leads to the massive wealth inequality that we now see. Why the financial elites and the rich have gotten so much richer and the poor have gotten poorer. It really ticks me off when I hear leftists and statists talk about how the free market causes wealth inequality. The free market doesn't. The free market throughout history has allowed poor people to pull themselves up and has given people more socioeconomic ability to move up and down the socioeconomic ladder up than anything else in history. Paul Krugman, who is a Keynesian economist par excellence, just wants to inflate like crazy, but yet he writes a column for the New York Times, and it's called Conscious of a Liberal, because he loves poor people, despite the fact that he's the guy that's killing them. But then he'll look at someone like me and say, you hate the poor. I don't hate the poor. I hate the fact that they're poor. This is a chart of the purchasing power of the dollar since 1800. As you can see, it's lost, this is a little after the year 2000. They say it's worth about 7 cents on the dollar. It's less than that now. It's lost over 95% of its purchase power. By the way, these dotted lines are points when the dollar was not backed by gold. You can see the correlation. When it's backed by gold, the dollar's strong because there is a limit on the central bank's ability to inflate. When it's not backed by gold, it drops. This is a very interesting part of the chart right here. As you can see, much of this drop has come after 1971. 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Now what that means is that because of LBJ's Guns and Butter program, because of LBJ's Great Society, and then the war in Vietnam, we had guns and butter. And they were inflating like crazy. They couldn't pay for both. Well, after World War II, the victors of World War II, the Allies, got together in a town called, in the Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire, and they came up with a new economic system, a new basically world's currency. The world reserve currency, the thing basically that would be used to settle accounts between nations would no longer be gold, it would be the dollar. But the US promised to back the dollar at $35 per ounce of gold. Well, you had all this money now being thrown out into our economies, and because we were the world's reserve currency, which meant that other countries kept it in reserve, that's what they traded in as well, it was going into other countries. The French aren't stupid, really. And their finance minister, I believe it was very familiar with what we're talking about here in a second, the Weimar inflation, or the Weimar Republic hyperinflation. So he told President de Gaulle, he's like, the Americans are printing money like crazy, and you better get your gold out because they cannot redeem it at $35 an ounce anymore. There's too many dollars out there to redeem it at that price. Treasury Secretary told President Nixon the same thing. President Nixon shut the gold window. He told other countries, you can no longer redeem your gold or your dollars in gold. Incidentally, it had actually been illegal for American citizens to hold gold, which had previously been money since 1933. It wouldn't become legal for Americans, except in rare cases of numismatic coins or jewelry. It wouldn't become legal for Americans again to buy gold until 1975. But if you were a foreigner in a foreign country, you could buy the gold. What that happened is that severed the last link between gold and the dollar, and that's been the result. Now, in a second, we're going to talk about what replaced that system. The dollar is not money itself. It is a measure of money. Okay? An inch is not length. An inch is the measure of length. Ounces and pounds are not weight themselves. They are a measure of weight. Same with the dollar. In fact, if you look at money around the world, they all come from measurements. The pound sterling, right? The term dollar is derived from the term thaler, which is an abbreviation of Joachimthaler, which is a silver coin from the city of Joachimthal in Bohemia. I'm butchering that. In Bohemia, where some of the coins were first issued in 1518. Now, the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, that part that no one listens to, that actually tells Congress what they're only supposed to do, and only that. But anyway, as you can see, they play word games with that too. Ben Bernanke went on 60 Minutes a few years ago, and he said the Federal Reserve has the power delegated by Congress to create money. The U.S. Constitution does not say that. It says to coin money. And what they meant by that was to put gold and silver into a coin form. They also have the power to regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin. What they mean by that, same thing with the Second Amendment. Regulate does not mean control. Regulate just meant to make sure that something was in proper working order. In other words, the foreign coin and our coin was of a certain weight and purity. Then you will notice that the Congress's monetary power is put in the same clause as its power to set the standards of weights and measures. Why would they do that? Because it's a measurement, it's a weight. Article 1, Section 10 says that no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payments of debt. And then the Coinage Act of 1792 established the dollar as 371 and 4/16 grain pure, or 416 grain standard silver. If I was a trial lawyer, I think that I could safely say I have proven that the dollar is just a term for gold and silver, a certain amount of gold and silver, but it is not money in and of itself. However, we saw with the previous slide how badly the dollar has been abused over the years, how far its purchasing power has fallen. When money dies, really bad things happen. I have some coins here. I have a coin from the Weimar Republic hyperinflation. This coin is from 1923. I was told that it is the highest denominated coin ever issued. It's 50 million marks. I showed it to my daughter, and she was like, wow, how much is that worth? I was like, I paid $36 for it. It's a novelty. And it's made out of like some sort of pot metal. You guys can pass that around. This note is from the same time period. This is the one I want. This is a 1,000 mark note. Now that's not too bad, right? 1,000, I mean, we have like $100 bills. This one's a 1,000 mark note. You'll notice the back. A few months later, they are issuing let's see, that is a 100 million mark note. And you will notice the back. They were printing money so rapidly that they weren't even printing both sides of their bills. In fact, there's stories about people would go in and they would take a 1,000 mark note, and when it got really bad, they would take a 100 million mark note, and they had a rubber stamp, and they'd say, okay, this is worth $1 billion now, out the door you go. So, when money dies, really bad things happen. This is from a public restroom in Zimbabwe, which has gone through hyperinflation. Toilet paper only to be used in this toilet. No cardboard, no clothes, no newspapers, and no Zim dollars. People were literally using their currency as toilet paper. You could have $100 billion. You could be a billionaire, and you could buy 3 eggs. You could be a billionaire, but you weren't like Bill Gates because you were starving. This is from Weimar, Germany. This lady is heating her house with marks because the paper was worth more as a fuel than it was to go and buy something with it. Those are all sort of funny. This is not. Now imagine that you rely on Social Security, or imagine that you have a life insurance policy that is supposed to carry you through your golden years when you retire. It's going to be worth $500,000. But by the time that you get it, that $500,000 is only worth 2 bags of groceries. That also happened in the Weimar Republic. People would cash in their life insurance policies and realized that all I could buy with them was a bus ticket. This is from Argentina. People get really upset when their life savings are destroyed through no fault of their own. They tend to riot. There tends to be civil unrest. And unfortunately, they often turn to people like this who say, if you just give me all the power, I'll fix everything. The hyperinflation in the Weimar Republic was a precipitating factor in the rise of Adolf Hitler. Now, I don't know what's going to happen here. Economics is not a predictive science. I don't know if I hope to goodness we don't get a strong man. I hope to goodness that people realize that limited government and things like constitutions are really good ideas, but unfortunately, you never can tell. So I don't know what the future holds. Economics is not a predictive science. There are also some different factors, unique factors in this case. The world has never before been on a fiat currency standard. The dollar is not backed by anything. It hasn't been since 1971. Before, some currency somewhere was backed by gold. That's never been the case now. So I heard Glenn Beck speak 2 years ago in Knoxville, and he was exactly right when he said that the world has never been this close to the world economy collapsing virtually overnight. And that's true. I don't know if that's going to happen. I hope to goodness it doesn't. But nevertheless, we're talking not just about a U.S. problem here, but about a world problem. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, which gives an advantage because other countries around the world want dollars. They hold them in reserve. It's also what they use to exchange, or what they use to settle accounts with one another. Yeah. Let's talk a second about the petrodollar. As I said, in 1971, Richard Nixon closed the gold window. Well, Nixon and his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, realized this was going to cause some problems. This would undermine confidence and faith in the dollar, which is very, very, very important because hyperinflation is not actually a mechanical event. Right? It's not, the government can print all the money at once. As long as the people are still trading and still want the money, you're not going to have an event like you would have in Weimar, Germany. It's once people realize, my goodness, this money isn't worth anything, and they start trying to get rid of it as fast as they can. When the velocity, and that's part of the reason we haven't seen inflation, is because our velocity of money has just plummeted back to the Great Depression levels. What happens in a hyperinflation is the velocity of money goes through the roof, and then it's fueled by all the money that's come into the system. Well, Kissinger and Nixon realized that. So they went to Saudi Arabia, and they told the House of Saud, look, here's the deal. We will protect your regime militarily if you will price oil in dollars. What that does is that creates an artificial demand for dollars, another one. Because if you want to buy a barrel of oil, you have to have dollars first. So if you're Japanese and you have yen, somehow you have to acquire dollars, whether you get it from your central bank, whether you get it from your exports. It's traded for dollars. This is a huge trade that happens around the world. So you can see we have been able to export a lot of this money that's been printed over the years. There's more dollars outside of this country than there are in this country because they use it to buy oil and other commodities with. And it also explains, unfortunately, I think, why we're so involved in the Middle East, because they have to protect the petrodollar. Because if they don't, that artificial demand for dollars goes away, and all those dollars could come flooding back here, which would have just dramatically bad economic consequences. China and Russia are threatening the dollar's reserve status. The Chinese are now the world's #1 producer of gold, but none of that gold leaves the country. The Chinese government prohibits the exportation of gold by law. Well, not only that, the Chinese are buying gold like crazy too. And I suspect that they have a lot more gold than they say that they do. And I think, and I'm not Chinese, but I think what's going to happen is eventually the Chinese are going to say, hey, all you guys that are using dollars around the world, well, we all know the Americans are printing money like crazy because they tell us, well, we've got this little renminbi here, which is 40% backed by gold. Why don't you guys start trading in it? The Russians are doing the same thing. The Chinese and Russians are also negotiating bilateral trade agreements with countries around the world, bypassing the dollar. So that world's reserve currency is under threat. And I am not a conspiracy guy, folks, but there is a move on to implement a one world currency. This gentleman, I've referred to him before, is John Maynard Keynes, the dominant, the preeminent economist of the 20th century. Keynes' ultimate dream was something called a bancor. That's what he tried to push through at Bretton Woods. A bancor is it's a world fiat currency. It's a basket of fiat currencies from all the nations of the world, or a weighted basket. But nevertheless, it is a fiat currency that was to be used as the world's reserve currency. I travel all around the world. This is a picture that I took, I want to say it was in Belfast. You will notice this term here, and then I'm sorry, this is for baggage claims. Like if an airline loses your bag, this is what the EU says that you're entitled to. It says that you're entitled to 4,150 SDR. Does anyone know what an SDR is? Special drawing right. Thank you, you guys are with it. Special drawing right. That's right. That's the IMF's money. That would, if sort of the powers that be on the world stage had their way, would be the one world currency. Now, I don't think we'd be using the US, we'd still be using dollars, but when the US trades, that would be what would replace the dollar as that reserve currency. I do not think, though, that's going to happen. I think before that happens, we will see a move towards decentralization. And this is only speculation on my part, and wild speculation. This is the Electoral College map from 2008. I think what may happen is when we see these states like California, Illinois, and New York, who've been so absolutely fiscally irresponsible, and they start asking the federal government for a bailout, what's Tennessee going to do? Tennessee going to go, oh, yeah, sure, give them $100 billion that we're going to pay for eventually. And also, and what does the federal government do? How does it get its money? It takes the money from us, right? And then it turns around and bribes the states and threatens them. If you guys don't do this, we're going to withhold your funding for various projects. What happens when the dollar, they aren't able to do that anymore because the dollar isn't worth very much, worth not near anything. I think that the dollar is the glue that holds our current system of federalism, which is not what the founding fathers had in mind. I think it's the glue which holds everything together. And I think if the dollar were to start to fail, the states would begin to assert the sovereignty that they were supposed to have all along instead of ceding it to the federal government. Again, wild speculation on my part. What can I do? First of all, understand what is happening and why. Make a couple book recommendations. First one is What Has Government Done to Our Money by Murray N. Rothbard. Basically, he goes through, of course, much better than I can, and says everything I just said, but in a much better way, but also written so that anyone, the layperson, can understand it. And it's only about 90 pages long. It's well worth your while. The second is The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is a history of central banking and the Federal Reserve System. Again, very well written, and this reads like a detective novel. And if you don't know anything about the Fed, it really was the result of a conspiracy. The people that formed the Fed met in secret. It's called Jekyll Island because it's in Jekyll Island, Georgia. And they went to J.P. Morgan's nice big mansion they had there, and they were going duck hunting. And they didn't even tell people, like they didn't even tell their own families what they were doing. And they would only address themselves by their first names, and they left in secret on a train in secret. So the whole thing, like I said, it reads like a detective novel. It's very good. Also, at policy level, advocate for auditing the Federal Reserve, a full audit. People will say that the Fed is audited now, and it is, except for the really important stuff. What the Federal Open Markets Committee, that is the body that is tasked with monetary policy, with buying assets and selling assets. That is not audited. So they could go out and they could buy $10 billion of a stock, which they can buy virtually anything now, and we wouldn't know it. Okay? The other thing is that the Fed can have relations with foreign central banks and foreign governments, and that is not audited. So for instance, right now, Congress and the President are debating whether there's going to be military action against Syria. Meanwhile, it is conceivable, I do not think this is happening, but it is conceivable that the Fed could be sending money to Syria. We don't know. In fact, during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, the Federal Reserve lent out $17 trillion to various entities around the world, foreign governments, foreign central banks, big banks here at home. Yeah.
And individuals.
Yes. And we wouldn't have known for that except ironically, except for the investigative efforts of Bernie Sanders, who's a socialist senator from Vermont. I don't know how that happened. But anyway, we actually don't know what the Fed is doing. And I think if the American people were to see what the Fed was doing and what they have done to our money and who gets that money, they would be very upset. And we should replace the Fed with free market money, with gold and silver, or at least, our free market money could actually be anything, what the market decides, or at least return to a precious metal backing for our dollar, which constitutionally is what we're supposed to have all along. Henry David Thoreau said that there are thousands hacking at the branches of evil to the one who is striking at the root. I think that our monetary system at a federal level, as it currently stands with the Federal Reserve, is the root. It allows the government to grow and grow and grow because they can just print money. They don't tax us directly, they tax us through inflation. And we end up getting upset about inflation, but we don't blame it on the right people. It's them. It is the root of all evil, at least as far as politics is concerned, and it is the cause of big government, in my opinion. So, and thank you guys very much. I really appreciate being here. Do we have time for questions?
Why don't we take about 5-10 minutes for questions, and then I'm sure Glenn will be around to also talk to people individually. So, all right. Kurt?
Yes, sir.
Yes, there's not enough gold in the United States to cover our $17 trillion.
No. It's not only $17 trillion. It's yeah, it's whatever number you want to throw out for the unfunded liabilities. And if you look at, okay, you have different metrics for the money, the actual money supply, not the debt level. You have M1, M2, and we used to have M3, but the Fed, an organization that prints money, has said that it's too expensive to produce the M3 report. Anyway, but each of those is broader, okay? And depending on what metric you use, you're going to get back, yeah, you would have to have gold at $15,000 an ounce if you use M3 to cover everything. So, yeah, that's why you would see a deflation, a massive deflation. That's why when people like say, why don't we just replace the Fed? I would rather allow the Fed to have competition with gold and silver. Like in Tennessee, there was a move on, and hopefully it will be reintroduced next year, to take the sales tax off of gold and silver bullion, okay? If people could start using other forms of money, because it's legal tender, you can't use other stuff as money to a certain extent without getting in trouble. You know, we've also seen things like Bitcoin come along. Bitcoin is an electronic currency. I don't really understand how it works, but some people do, and that's caught on fire. And of course now, I think the Treasury or the IRS or someone is trying to shut down the Bitcoin people. You know, so that's what I think it is. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, you're exactly right. You're gonna have a heck of a lot of trouble, but we can't pay. Here's the thing: we can't pay that anyway. You know, I mean, the way they're going to pay. How are they going to pay Lawrence Kutlikoff, who was an economic advisor to President Reagan and is a professor at the Boston University now? He estimates that the unfunded liabilities are actually over $200 trillion. Okay, that's impossible to pay. So there is no way out. It's terrible to say this, right? But what should have happened is in 2007, 2008, they should have allowed the market to do what it's going to do, which would have been very painful. And it would have been the most painful for the people like the big banker folks, the politically influential. That's why it really didn't happen. The longer they put this off, the longer they keep on putting more money into the system, at some point, you know, all these distortions now are in the economy. All this money's out there. At some point, these debts are going to have to be paid back. You know, so I don't know what the answer is, but the way I see it, they're in a box that's getting smaller and smaller and smaller, and their choices are going to be hyperinflation, which, you know, I don't know if that's even feasible. Default on the debt. Or they're going to have to change the monetary system. Probably what's going to happen maybe is there may be a worldwide reset in the monetary system, and they may actually do something to try to bring confidence back in the system, like partly backing it by gold or something like that. But yeah, your comment is, well, there is not. They have messed things up so badly at this point that yeah, there's not enough gold to do it. Yes, sir.
I found one of the simplest ways to keep up with it is $1,000 face value of U.S. silver coins. Got 715 ounces of silver in it. How much that cost you today? Over 15,000.
Yeah.
That tells you how worthless the dollar.
Oh yeah, this is Silver Eagle, and this is going to be from like 2000, I think. But in any case, if this had been issued in 1900, it would pretty much still buy the same thing today that it did in 1900. Now we see short-term fluctuations in the silver market, but nevertheless, over the long term, gold and silver, gold still buys at its current prices a suit, a belt, and a pair of shoes, which was the same thing that it bought during Rome, when you could buy a toga, some sandals, and a belt with it. So you're exactly right. Yes, sir.
Do you see any advantage in individual states establishing their own state?
Yes.
And how do you see that relating with the federal government?
Yeah. Well, if the feds don't come in and just crush them, I think there is. I would like the government to be completely out of the money issue, except for what it's constitutionally supposed to do, which is prevent counterfeiting, right? But I see it as competition. You know, you can sort of get out. In fact, I think it's the Bank of North Dakota, right? Are you aware of that? Yeah. And then also, I was told that Tennessee might be able to do that. There's something called, and you guys might know, called the Tennessee State Trust, which, if it were activated, could act as you guys should look into that. I was told that by a state senator, and it could act as a state bank. So yeah. And I also think, which I believe South Carolina has done it, some other states have done it, taking sales tax off of bullion so that people can use that without being punished. Yeah. Yes, sir.
With quantitative easing and all the money they're putting in the system, how do you go back to some kind of gold or silver standard? I mean, take the money out and burn it or destroy it, or how do you go about that?
Yeah. Again, what I would do I would allow the market to do it, and I wouldn't say, hey, we're gonna go back on a gold standard. I would just allow gold and silver. Take the advantages that the fiat currency currently has, such as legal tender, such as sales tax on gold and silver. Take those away to allow gold and silver to compete with the dollar. Then the market's going to figure it out. Yeah. Now maybe I am speaking of my own self-interest because I do own some gold and silver, and I could see the price of it skyrocketing, but it wouldn't be skyrocketing, of course, in terms of purchasing power. It'd be skyrocketing in terms of, except at the very end when everybody started buying. It would, yeah. But
Physically use the gold or silver as currency.
yes. And people will be like, well, that would, in this day and age, that you couldn't do that, right? But actually, I think it would be a lot easier than it was back in the day because there's a service now called goldmoney.com, okay? And you can only use it with another person that has another account holder. But what it does is it digitally now the gold's there, okay? It's not a fractional reserve system, but it digitally credits different accounts. Like if I bought something from you and we're both in the gold money system and it was an ounce of gold or like 100 grains of gold, it would debit your account and then credit my account. And then if I wanted to, I could go get it. Well, we have these little plastic cards called debit cards. Why couldn't our system essentially work the same way? Instead of, and it would still be working on dollars, they would just be backed by gold and silver. Yes, ma'am, I'm sorry.
Do you worry that the gold in Fort Knox is there?
Yeah. I think the last time that Fort Knox was audited was 1959. Do you know? Something like that. It's been a long time ago. Now, I have a theory, and this may be incorrect. This is just my own theory. I think the gold, most of it is still there. However, central banks engage in a practice called gold leasing, where if I'm the Bank of England, I ask the Fed or the government or the Treasury, and actually there's a lot of gold in the New York Fed as well. In fact, I'll get back to that in a second. Anyway, in fact, Germany, did you guys hear about this? Germany recently demanded their gold from the New York Fed, and they said, and it wasn't that much. It was less than a year's production of gold. And they were like, yeah, you can get it in over a 7-year period. And I think the reason for that, in Fort Knox, they don't know who owns it, okay? Because everybody has it on their books. Like, we'll lend it to the Bank of England. Well, now they've got a ton of gold. We still keep the ton of gold on our books. We lend it to the Bank of Japan. Now they have a ton of gold too. We still have a ton of gold on our books. So I think that I don't think maybe the physical audit of Fort Knox is so important as looking at the books and saying, oh my gosh, this gold has been counted 10 times, which would mean if we're looking at the paper market and the spot price of gold, and all these people thought there was this much gold out there, and then they realize, oh my gosh, you have all these titles to this gold, there's really only this much gold out there. Nevertheless, and I've heard this thrown out there too, what could happen is if things really fall apart and say the U.S. were to go back on a gold standard and everybody else were to, hey, we want our gold, possession is 9/10 of the law. We got it. And that may be the reason that I still think it's there. And when everybody else says we want it, nope, it's ours, and you guys try to take it.
So you really don't think China's gotten some out the back door?
They could have. I don't know. Anyway, yes, sir. Last one.
Yeah, no, well, just good morning. Lane, you had a question in the middle of the thing, so.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, sir.
And then we'll get to you.
You're talking about the Fed buying bonds. That's how they're putting their money into the.
They're buying that, and they're also still buying mortgage-backed securities. That's why the housing market is recovered.
Okay. So then that money from the bonds, the money that those who were bond owners used to have, now have the money for their bonds. They're taking that money and putting it into stocks.
The Fed, that's a very good question. All right. First of all, it's a little more complex than that. The Fed can't buy the bonds directly. It's prohibited to do that. What it does is it will like buy old bonds from banks. It's not buying it from individuals. But then the banks turn around and buy the bonds. All right. And it's sort of an arbitrage play where the Fed is loaning them money at 1%, and then they're getting 4% for the government. However, and I'm not saying that the Fed is buying stocks. That was just, they could. They, I think it was the Monetary Act of 1980. Before that, they were very limited on what they could buy. The Monetary Act of 1980 sort of blew that out. That's why they could buy mortgage-backed securities like they have been doing. Currently, they're buying, I think, it's $40,000 or $45,000 of bonds a month, but then it's 40 or 45, I can't remember which, of mortgage-backed securities per month. By the time it gets all together, they're buying 85, or they're pumping $85 billion a month into the system.
Okay, my personal theory has been that they're trying to get this money into the stock market, to pump the stock market up through agency, not agency, but like retirement accounts for their union buddies.
That could be.
Because there's a lot of dark pool buying going on. An awful lot of stocks are actually, awful lot of stocks are actually in retirement accounts.
Yep.
Like CalPERS, when I was employed I was a teacher in California.
Right, that's right.
CalPERS, most of their money is in stocks. And if stocks get inflated, it helps out the
Yeah,
union.
yeah, and also, and yeah, you're right. And what did Bernanke say that he's on record as saying what is one of his prime objectives? To get the stock market up and to keep it up. And that creates the wealth effect, which he thinks is going to cause people. So they
It's also
could.
a prime measure of
Yeah.
economic recovery.
Yeah, when people look, a lot of times people look at the stock market and say that's it. Yeah,
We're doing okay because stocks are doing
we don't know, and that's another reason the Fed should be audited, because we don't know, right? So, but that is a good theory, and it quite possibly could be true. Yes, sir.
Quick question, aren't you concerned the government will try to confiscate gold again?
Yes and no. I think what they were going to do. First of all, okay, turn the camera off for a second. Turn the camera off.